And we are continuing our discussion of Mamzerut, basically the status of illegitimate children, or what makes a Jew a Mamzer, an illegitimate Jew, illegitimate religiously. I got to be careful how I characterize this. Um, and then I also have an article which um, is interesting and somewhat related, called Artificial Insemination in Judaism. So let me remember to do share screen. Okay, so I know, Joanne, you spent a lot of time reading last time. Would someone other than Joanne like to read to give her a little bit of a rest?
I'll give it a start.
Okay, thank you, Bob.
In the
And I think
modern
this is where we are in Israeli law. It's almost at the end of this article.
in the modern state of Israel, the law concerning matters of marriage, divorce, and personal status is particularly under
Partially, actually.
jurisdiction of the religious courts. For example, there is no civil marriage in Israel. The Jewish religious regulations concerning Mamzerism are thus also the national laws imposed on Jews living in Israel, including secular Jews. Because of the severe impediments to marriage, which Mamzer status accords in Jewish law, Israeli civil law has taken the position that paternity of a child born within a marriage cannot legally be challenged in civil courts. In order to avoid creating a body of evidence that might be used to declare the child a mamzer or create difficulties for a future marriage.
So again, just to remind you, the a if a man and woman, Jewish man and woman, have a child out of wedlock, there is no issue of that child being a mamzer, or what's called in English a bastard, or an illegitimate. That there's zero issue. The definition of a mamzer is a child born of a prohibited sexual relationship, and the predominant examples would be adultery or incest. And then the rules are particularly harsh in that a mamzer cannot marry another Jew I'm now talking about Orthodoxy. They can only marry a non-Jew or a mamzer or another mamzer. And the thing that they point out here, which is an issue, and I think it's slowly changing. I think, Alan Warshaw is more on top of this than I am in Israel, is all marriages are religious. It's actually exactly the opposite of what we were describing before. In the United States, you can have religious marriages and civil marriages. In many countries, and I'll just talk about the ones that I'm sure of, certainly Mexico and France, they are two separate issues. That if you get married in a religious ceremony in Mexico or a religious ceremony in France, it has no status on on whether you're considered to be married by the country. In Israel, it's actually the opposite. There is no civil marriage. The only marriages are in churches and in synagogues and mosques, and I guess it could be other religions too. So you had this situation where if you had two Jews and they wanted to get married, but they didn't want to go to an Orthodox rabbi, because the Reform rabbis are typically not recognized by the state, they would have to get married outside of Israel, because marriages outside of Israel are recognized inside of Israel. And for many years, this was done by going to Cyprus, which was very close, another country. You get married in Cyprus, and that marriage would be recognized in the state of Israel. And then there's there has been some. We talked about this last time in some states in the United States will allow marriage over Zoom. So you can, I think in Montana and then maybe one or two other states.
Utah.
And
I thought it was just Utah, but you're okay.
I know it was Montana for a while
Mhm.
because I had some connection with that. So you could get married by Zoom in Utah. You'd have a U.S. marriage license, and then that marriage would be recognized by the state of Israel. And then you could go to a Reform rabbi and have a Reform ceremony. I don't know, Alan, if you want to add anything to that, or
Just that, of course, the remote concept was introduced during Zoom, and
you talk about during COVID.
COVID. Sorry, COVID.
Yeah, actually, in Montana, it was actually you could do it by proxy, so it wasn't exactly remote on Zoom.
Oh, you got your Hebrew name up.
I did. I put my Hebrew name up.
Well, that's
for
very
this one.
sweet.
Okay,
Look at
I'm
that.
gonna mute Kira. Okay.
Well, what I was going to add, Michael, was
That's very cute. Oh.
is that the High Court in Israel actually agreed to the Utah-Montana approach that
okay.
that has. So the court, this obviously the Orthodox rabbinate would take them to the court on that because weren't happy, but the court said nope, it's okay.
Okay. So would someone else like to continue reading at Israeli religious courts? Cheryl, go ahead.
Israeli religious courts resolve Mamzer status by generally ruling that the child was born within the marriage, despite the existence of evidence to the contrary. This convenient formula sometimes causes difficulties for lovers or subsequent spouses who wish to assert paternity over a child which may be biologically theirs. A 2006 case in which a child born 8 months and 2 weeks after a divorce was declared the former husband's child rather than the child of the wife's subsequent husband, and this was reported as causing a dilemma for the subsequent couple. Nonetheless, the existence of the category of Mamzer and the marital impediments inherent to it is one of the arguments frequently used by Israeli secularists in calling for separation of religion and state and for the institution of civil marriage. In 2014, the Center for Women's Justice announced it would petition the Israeli Supreme Court to bar secret blacklists of Mamzerim by rabbinical courts, claiming they are an invasion of privacy.
Let's see. Okay, just Cheryl, why don't you just read this last paragraph and then we'll be done with the article.
Connection with French medieval nicknames. A persistent etymology of the surname Mamzer is connected to Hebrew Mamzer. Supposedly, Ebalus of Aquitaine, Count of Poitou, and Duke of Aquitaine, 870 to 935, had the nickname Mamzer, or Mamzer, as he was known to have been a bastard and reputed to have had a Jewish mother. This nickname is considered to be derived from Mamzer. A similar explanation is offered also for the same nickname as used by another prince from Occitania, Arnaud Mamzer, a 10th century count of Anjouan, who also was a bastard. William the Conqueror may have been referred to as Bastardus and Mamzer.
Okay, didn't know any of that. I'm going to stop sharing. We can talk about the situation with the issue of a rabbi declaring someone a mamzer. I know we discussed this last time, that certainly I know of many cases, and I started reading some of the responsa on this. Cheryl found actually a concurring opinion of a responsa, which itself was about 5 or 6 pages of very small type, and the actual responsum is like 25 pages of very small type. And I scanned that. I didn't read it, all of it, but there were cases where it's pretty clear this person is a mamzer, and the rabbis would search for reasons to cast doubt on it, and to cast doubt on the evidence for the person being a mamzer. in the conservative movement, and one of the things I always appreciate is Jewish law in the conservative movement. Jewish law in the Orthodox movement is clearly very, very important to Orthodox Jews. And I would say, you know, well, I mean, different members of Orthodox synagogues may consider themselves bound or not bound by Orthodox rules, but certainly it's binding, and it is not what you would call flexible. In the conservative movement teaches that Jewish law is binding on all Jews, but it changes with the times. So the conservative movement really struggles with Jewish law. The Reform movement, I would say, there's a phrase that's often used that Jewish law gets a vote but not a veto. So there is a responsa committee, and I'll talk about, or maybe Cheryl, you can talk about the correspondence you had with the chairperson of that committee in a moment. So there is a responsa committee, and they address issues like this. And in fact, we're going to look, well, no, we're going to look at a conservative discussion of artificial insemination. But in reality, many Reform Jews don't consider themselves bound by those rules. And even synagogues don't necessarily consider themselves bound by those rules. So the conservative movement is the one movement in Judaism that both considers Jewish law binding, and they're open to changing and struggling with Jewish law. So their legal discussions are, I think, very interesting and educational. And in glancing at that responsum on Mamzerut, they basically came to the conclusion that in this day and age, we reject all proofs that someone is a mamzer, that there will always be sufficient doubt, that we are just not going to consider that status. So they're taking sort of interesting approach, if I understand it correctly, that they're saying that we're still recognizing that Mamzerut can exist, but we think there's so much doubt on lineage and paternity that that we're going to not reply it or not make it binding. Now, last time, I'm gonna actually, Cheryl just posted. So Cheryl, you just posted an item in chat, and then also we started raising the question of, suppose these days, unlike for the last 1,500 years since the Talmud, you can actually do a DNA test and prove that a child is the product of a woman and a man, not her husband, and was born while the woman was married. So the question is, how do we deal with that? So, Cheryl, you want to read what you just posted?
Yeah, I mean, I went to the responsa committee. The head is a Dr. Rabbi Joan Friedman, and her email address is there, and I asked her that exact question. Since there's DNA, if somebody, and let's assume everybody's Jewish, but if somebody finds out years later or whatever that the kid that they had is not the biological child of the person they're married to, what do you do? So she says to me, yes, a mamzer is the child conceived in a sexual relationship between two Jews that could not, at the time of the child's conception, be eligible for kiddushin.
Kiddushin is a technical term for Jewish marriage.
That means any incestuous relationship or any relationship between two unrelated adults, if the woman is already married to another Jewish man. It is for that reason that very traditional Jews regard all Reform Jews as potential mamzerim, because we have eliminated the get and consider civil divorce alone sufficient to end the kiddushin between a couple. And thus, a woman without a Jewish divorce from a first husband may marry a second and have children who would be mamzerim. Joan Friedman.
So the thing that struck me about her answer is she didn't really answer the question, what do Reform Judaism teach about this, conservative Judaism and Orthodox Judaism, now that we have DNA testing? And she really didn't address that. She said
No, she
yes.
didn't address me, yeah, at all about that. And I wasn't gonna press her more like, wait a minute.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
in theory, a rabbi could press her with a specific case, and I don't know that there has been a specific reform responsa on Mamzerut. I don't think there is. But then she also mentioned something which I never heard before, which I find fascinating. She said, "Is for that reason that very traditional Jews regard all Reform Jews as potential mamzerim, because we've eliminated the get and consider civil divorce alone sufficient to end kiddushin between a couple." So first, I want to make sure you understand what she's saying. She's saying, you have a couple, they are part of Reform Judaism, they get a civil divorce, and in Reform Judaism, we don't even offer a get. There is something called a document of separation, but it doesn't meet the traditional legal Jewish requirements for a get. And then the woman remarries, and she has children, and so therefore all of her children are potentially mamzers. But I've never heard this. I've never heard. Actually, next time I run into, well, I see Elliot Dorff, who's the author of our next article, all the time. But next time I run into a Chabad rabbi, I should ask about this, because I've never heard in traditional Judaism anybody pursuing that. I mean, if that were really taken seriously, then presumably a Orthodox rabbi, Chabad or any Orthodox rabbi, would not officiate at the marriage of someone who was raised in a Reformed tradition because of suspected Mamzerut. My guess is that suspicion is not sufficient legal witnessing. You need two witnesses and so on to declare someone a Mamzer. But it is a very interesting and provocative idea. Alan.
Can I say something about DNA, not directly about Mamzer?
Okay, sure.
So just I have an experience with one of the Iraq people, the Reform movement, helping a couple support their right to return to Israel from a complicated history of the couples who originally from Syria. But the point is, the court, because there's a problem identifying the baby's father, because he was out of the room when they signed the birth certificate, so there's no name on this kid. And I think they've worked around it, but at the time that I talked to Nikki, I knew the court would accept a DNA test between the father and the mother as support that this is the right child and therefore qualifies for the right of return.
Yeah, but that has literally nothing to do with the subject we're talking about, because we're talking about the civil laws in Israel. The right of return is not religious law.
Okay.
So yeah, if you can establish, and presumably the mother of the child was Jewish, right? I mean,
they both, yes, they were both Jewish.
Yeah, so I think if you have one Jewish parent, you have right of return. There was a case mentioned in the responsa of a couple that was arguing that the product of their second marriage was not a mamzer, and in the first marriage they couldn't find the ketubah. This was cited in the responsa that I pursued with Cheryl's lead. They couldn't find the ketubah, and the father, the original father, converted to Christianity, so he wouldn't have anything to do with any legal proceedings. And because they couldn't prove, so according to Jewish courts now, it has nothing to do with Israeli civil courts. According to the Jewish court, they couldn't prove that the woman was ever married to the first husband. So therefore, they declared the product of the second marriage as not mamzers.
There may have been an issue, because now that I remember, both the mother and father were converts, and they were converted in a proper ceremony by our understanding in Portugal. But nevertheless, maybe this proof of that the baby DNA, somehow that came up. Anyway,
okay. But it is important to distinguish between civil legal issues and Jewish religious issues. This comes up all the time in conversions. You know, it's no secret, I'm working with Henry toward a conversion, and Henry knows very well that his conversion will not be accepted in Israel as making him Jewish for the Orthodox authorities, but it would be accepted, at least the way the law stands today, under the law of return to allow him automatic citizenship. There are right-wing forces in Israel that are trying to change that law of return. You know, as if Israel doesn't have any other serious problems, so they are going to annoy the rest of the world by changing that law.
Can we quote you?
Yes, you can.
Well, you know, it's a well-known maxim that there is no situation so dire enough that you can't throw someone else out of the lifeboat.
I guess unless you're there alone, or it says if you're in a deep hole, the first thing you should stop digging.
Stop digging.
Yes. Okay, so here's another interesting article about artificial insemination, which I think certainly is related to the issue of Mamzerut, and I presume you can see it. This is from My Jewish Learning, not as long an article, and it is by Rabbi Elliot Dorff. I don't know if there's a bio of his at the bottom. No, there isn't. He is the chairman of what would be considered the conservative movement's responsa committee. It's actually the Jewish Law Committee. And one interesting thing about the conservative movement is quite often when they make decisions, they will make decisions and there will be concurring opinions and minority opinions. And in some cases, it's left up to the rabbi to decide how they're going to apply the law. So that's a whole other interesting subject which we don't necessarily have to get into. So would someone else like to read? Let's give folks a rest.
I could do it.
Thank you. So artificial insemination.
Artificial insemination in Jewish law. Most rabbis permit artificial insemination using the husband's semen, but donor insemination raises more complicated questions.
You're muted, Bryce.
I know, I was just turning it up. Most rabbis who have written about artificial insemination, also known as AIH, have not objected to it because Judaism appreciates medicine as a divinely authorized aid to God. AIH is not prohibited among Jews as it is among Catholics, merely because it is artificial. Some rabbis, though, worry about the means by which the husband's sperm is obtained to ensure that there is no destruction of the seed in vain, in violation of the rabbinic interpretation of Genesis 38:9 through 10. These rabbis advocate collecting it from the vaginal cavity after intercourse. However, an obstetrician I consulted who has many observant Orthodox conservative patients told me that collecting sperm in that way is simply unrealistic. Moreover, the vaginal pH kills the sperm, hence it is more acidic than cervical mucus.
And I'll just point out, I don't know that we've ever discussed the issue of masturbation in this august forum, but in the story referenced in Genesis.
Are we voting?
In the discussion in Genesis, without getting into the details of it, but somebody spills their seed upon the ground. He's actually practicing coitus interruptus rather than actual masturbation, but spilling the seed, since the seed is potential life, it says it angered God. Doesn't say what aspect of it angered God, but the rabbis interpreted it as a prohibition against wasting seed. So in the Orthodox world, this I think has become more of this becomes an issue. Also, I have no idea what AIH stands for, artificial insemination, I guess, in humans, as opposed to horses and so on. And it is, we don't have Jim on the line, but I do think that the Catholic Church does not allow I know they don't allow in vitro fertilization, and I guess I'm just believing Elliot here. I don't know how old this article is. They also don't allow artificial insemination. I guess the idea that it's not natural is an issue for the Catholic Church, which I won't try and defend. Okay, so let's continue. Other rabbis?
Other rabbis permit the husband to use a condom, clearly one without spermicide, for the purpose of collecting his semen for AIH. Some of these rabbis insist that the condom have a small hole in it so that there is still some chance of conception through the couple's intercourse. While I have no particular objection to couples using such constraints, it does seem to me that they are unnecessary, for producing semen for the specific purpose of procreating cannot plausibly be called wasting it. Even some Orthodox rabbis agree and therefore permit a man to masturbate to produce semen for artificial insemination of his wife. I endorse this last approach.
And the ellipsis here indicates this is from a larger paper that he wrote. This also, I think, is kind of a nice highlighting of the difference between Orthodoxy and the conservative movement. So in Orthodoxy, if you've had old rulings on issues like masturbation, even for the purpose of artificial insemination, it's very hard for legal authorities to go against these rulings, whereas the conservative movement feels far more flexible. Thank you, Cheryl, for explaining the H. Okay, let's continue. Donor insemination.
Donor insemination, DI, and adultery. Since in DI, a married woman is being inseminated with the sperm of a man other than her husband, some rabbis construe DI as adultery. This would make any child born through DI illegitimate, a Mamzer. According to the Torah, such a person and his or her descendants may not marry a Jew for 10 generations. Rabbi Eliezer Waldenberg, for example, takes strong exception to donor insemination on these grounds. The very essence of this matter, namely placing in the womb of a married woman the seed of another man, is a great abomination of the tent of Jacob, and there is no greater profanation of the family than this in the dwelling places of Israel. This destroys all the sublime concepts of purity and holiness of Jewish family life, for which our people has been so noted since it became a nation. This, in my view, misreads the prohibition against adultery. Adultery is repugnant primarily because it violates the trust between husband and wife that must be the foundation of their relationship. The woman has cheated on her husband or vice versa. In standard cases of artificial insemination by a donor, however, the husband not only knows about the insemination, but deeply wants it so that he and his wife can have children. Contrary to Rabbi Waldenberg, then, artificial insemination by a donor is not an abomination or a profanation that destroys all Jewish concepts of holiness and purity, but rather a desperate attempt to have children, an undisputed good in marital relationships for the Jewish tradition, in a context of openness and trust. DI and the incest risk. If the identity of the donor is known, the people born through his sperm donation can and should avoid mating with his offspring through marriage so as to avoid incest, for their common father makes them, after all, half-brothers and half-sisters. Usually, though, the donor is anonymous, and that raises the possibility of unintentional incest in the next generation. That is, the person produced by artificial insemination might happen to marry one of the children of the donor and his wife, and since the children share a father, they would each be marrying their biological half-sibling. Both members of the couple and their families would be completely unaware that the relationship was incestuous, for just as recipients do not generally know the identity of the donors whose sperm they use, so too donors do not know the identity of the recipients. Could I ask a question, Rabbi?
Sure.
is the incestuousness prohibition about genetic relationship?
It's Torah.
Well, I understand that.
Yeah.
But
so-
it seems to me that the rabbi in this writing is conflating genetic siblinghood with incest as the
so
genealogical relationships,
yeah.
and this may not actually make sense.
So what I would say is the Torah prohibits these the sex between a half brother and a half sister. Let's say
Well, yeah, but
two
what
people-
defines
hold
half
on,
brother and half sister? No, I need a definition of half brother and half sister first.
right. So you have someone with the same father. So the issue here is a sperm donor, is donating sperm to a sperm bank and becoming the biological father of many children.
No, I get the whole issue.
Okay.
I get the whole issue.
Okay, so hold on. So let me answer the question. So the concern is that two biological half brothers and half sisters might marry and create incest even though they're not aware of it. I am certain that the Torah is unaware of DNA, and I think also unaware of of genetic problems with half brothers and half sisters marrying. I mean, there's
But if
actually
they're born to different mothers and never met, and
Right.
it just doesn't. Is fatherhood genetic, or is fatherhood? I don't think fatherhood can be genetic in the Torah. Okay, it isn't genetic. It's something else entirely. So I'm not
I don't know.
convinced that this is real.
So fatherhood is sperm. It's the sperm that impregnates the mother. I don't know what else it could be. An adopted child, it's a different issue. But that's what traditional Judaism is concerned about, is that
No,
you could have.
I understand, but just taking what you said before earlier with the fact that a child might be conceived from a different sperm, but Judaism recognizes that the father is the person who did not donate the sperm at all, that was just married to the mother.
No. So
But I mean,
it's
to avoid
more
Mamzerut.
hold on, it's more subtle technically. The issue is, what is adultery? The issue is artificial insemination adultery? In the case of in the conservative and reform movement, they're not going to consider artificial insemination adultery. In the Orthodox movement, they might well consider artificial insemination adultery. And so therefore, any children produced would automatically be mamzers. In this case, the issue isn't whether it was adultery. The issue is, are the children in the next generation likely to have a relationship prohibited by Torah? So even if it's not adultery, you still have potentially a half brother marrying a half sister, even though they're not aware of that relationship. That's the issue. And that issue is raised in the Torah. And so the question is, how is it addressed? Certainly in conservative law, and we're going to see how it's addressed in conservative law, but that's and even in Orthodoxy, but that's actually the issue. So it's slightly different. It's not adultery, but it does potentially create an incestuous relationship. You can be a Jew and not know it. So I always use the classic example of Madeleine Albright. So Madeleine Albright was the child of two Jews who converted to Christianity, but they converted after she was born. And I'm not sure that would even make a difference. So according to Jewish law, she is Jewish. So every time she has an Easter ham or, a ham and cheese, she is sinning under Jewish law, even though she's unaware of it. There's, in Jewish law, there's different statuses for a sin that you're not aware of. but legal status and legal issues are important in Judaism, and they have to be resolved with precision. And we're only halfway through the article. So
Usually the donor, should I go on?
yes, I think we're at if the donor, right?
Usually, I think it
Okay,
isn't
okay,
it
sorry.
usually,
I-
no, you're right. If the donor has not been identified, but it is known that he is not Jewish, sexual intercourse between the people born through his sperm donation and those born through his marriage would not technically constitute a violation of Judaism's laws prohibiting incest, even if the non-Jewish donor's wife is Jewish and thus his children are Jewish, for Jewish law does not recognize family lineage among non-Jews through the father's line. On that basis, Rabbi Moshe Feinstein permitted DI if the donor was not Jewish, although he was later pressured to withdraw his responsum.
So the interesting thing here is Feinstein, who is, I would say, the 20th century's leading Orthodox legal expert, said it's a very strange conclusion. I didn't realize that he was pressured to remove his responsum, that artificial insemination is okay for a Jewish couple so long as the donor is not Jewish, which is exactly the opposite of what you would think. You would think they would want to have a Jewish donor. I mean, particularly if you're thinking in terms of purity of the race or things like that. But in Feinstein's case, he was saying you don't want the father to be Jewish. So let's continue.
By the way, pure races have more problems than mongrels.
Yeah, and actually there's a whole list of Jewish genetic diseases. There are something like 20 Jewish genetic diseases because Jews are a fairly small number, and particularly in the Ashkenazi world, but also in the Sephardic world, until recently, the absolute rule was intramarriage. Jews would marry Jews. So then, therefore, the likelihood of genetic diseases, recessive genetic diseases, I wouldn't say are high, but real. And whenever I have a couple, which for me is maybe a quarter of the time or a third of the time, where both parents, where bride and groom are both Jewish, I insist on educating them on Jewish genetic diseases, and I send them a lot of information on that. But yes, you're absolutely right. Okay, so let's read about the identity of the father.
DI, the identity of the father. The identity of the father is potentially an issue in 4 matters in Jewish law: the child's Jewish identity, priestly status, inheritance rights, the father's duty to procreate. The first 3 of those are, in most cases, fairly easily resolved, but the last is more troublesome. With regard to Jewish identity, it does not matter whether the donor of the semen is a Jew, for traditional Jewish law determines a person's Jewish identity according to the bearing mother. Since we're talking about the artificial insemination of a Jewish woman, her offspring are automatically Jewish no matter how she came to be pregnant. Where a Jewish couple will be raising the child, he or she may be known in Hebrew as the son or daughter of the social parents. The more complicated questions of personal status regarding the possibility of incest in the next generation have been treated above. Priestly status is determined by the biological father, for it is, according to the Torah, the seed of Aaron who are to perform the priestly duties. Therefore, if the donor is known to be, respectively, a Cohen, Levi, or Yisrael, the child has that status as well. If the donor's priestly status is not known, which is usually the case, the child is treated as a Yisraelion. Say that right?
Yeah, I think that's right. I've actually
Yisraelon.
never heard that word before. I would say
Yisraelon, and Yisraelon,
Mhm.
a default on a default as a Yisraelon. Oh, as a Yisrael on a default basis.
Oh, yes, you're right. There's There's a space missing. Yeah, I thought it was a
Okay.
new adjective.
Now it was
Yeah,
a new word,
yeah,
Yisrael
Yeah,
on.
and I ought to interject. Although whether you're a Jew or not, in modern Jewish law, certainly in Orthodoxy, we're going to see on Wednesday the discussion of who is a Jew and the Reform approach to this. Whether you're a Jew or not follows the mother's line, the father's status is irrelevant. What tribe you belong to goes with the father's line, and that goes back to biblical times. So the only tribes that are tracked these days are you a Kohen, which is a subset of the tribe of Levi, then you're a Kohen, you're a priest. If you're from the tribe of Levi, you're a Levite, and everybody else is considered an Israelite. So, for example, my late wife was a Levite. Her father was a Levi, but our children are not Levites because I am not either a Cohen or a Levite. Okay, let's continue. As for inheritance.
As for inheritance, would the child of DI inherit from the sperm donor, the husband, the social father, neither or both? While significant claims of justice, deep emotional feelings, and serious sums of money can all be at stake in deciding who is legally the father of a DI child, matters of inheritance are governed in the Americas and in Europe by civil law, not Jewish law.
Okay.
What Jewish law does determine, though, is whether a Jewish man fulfills the commandment to be fruitful and multiply if he consents to have his wife impregnated with another man's semen, if his own semen is artificially implanted in his wife's uterus, or if he himself is a semen donor.
And I'll just comment, it is a mitzvah, and remember, mitzvah means commandment, to be fruitful and multiply. So, of course, Judaism, being obsessively compulsive about mitzvot, going to come up with a discussion of how many children must someone have to fulfill that mitzvah. And I think the traditional answer is at least 2. And in some cases, they talk about a boy and a girl. But now the question is that Elliot's raising here is, what about artificial insemination? And I think we're almost done with this article, so let's see what he decides.
By and large, rabbis who have ruled on these matters thus far have maintained that for the purposes of this commandment, the father is the man who provides the semen. That would make a man who impregnates his wife through artificial insemination, AIH, the father of his child in Jewish law. And it would also make the semen donor the father of any children born through the use of his semen. On the other hand, it would deny the status of fatherhood with regard to the issues in Jewish law raised above to men who consent to have their wives impregnated with donor semen.
Just sort of interesting. We are, so we're going to finish a little early. Alan, go ahead.
I may be not remembering this properly, but a rabbi said to me once that the term "be fruitful and multiply" is directed at the woman.
I'm sure that's not, well,
Not
I
true.
don't believe that's true. One interesting question is, it's a positive mitzvah, but it's not time related. So my guess is it applies to men and women, but I don't think it would only apply to women. Clearly, in this discussion, it doesn't appear to be
I know,
way.
that's why I raised the question.
Yeah,
And it's interpreted the way we're now concluding is everybody contributes to that. Everybody has a responsibility, men and women, to be fruitful and multiply.
Yeah, that would be my interpretation.
I'm okay with that. Thanks.
And I do remember a legal decision. Elliot Dorff has actually written a book on medical ethics, and I think one time when we were meeting in person, we actually read the introduction to his book. It took us several meetings to do that, and an interesting case in this is if a couple is infertile and they can't have children, they are not held guilty of failing to be fruitful and multiply, because you can't be held to doing a mitzvah that you're incapable of doing.
The
Sure.
implication is natural sexual multiplying as opposed to adoption.
Well, the question is, would you be forced under Jewish law to adopt a child or
Yeah.
undergo artificial insemination if you could not have children? And what I remember is reading a discussion of this, and I don't remember that as being an obligation. Is it permitted? Of course. Is it an obligation? No. And that actually has implications under Jewish law, and Eliot has written on issues of homosexuality, which is to say, should you be forced under Jewish law to participate in a heterosexual relationship if you're homosexual? And so the conclusion is, at least among some authorities, certainly not in Orthodoxy, but Elliot Dorff in the conservative movement, and not all the conservative legal experts agree on this. But that's the issue then is, is homosexuality a ingrained behavior or is it a learned behavior? So that's, and I would also point out that we have lots of weddings. I personally conduct many weddings among people who are not planning on having children. And in many cases, it's because of their age. They already have grandchildren. And Judaism would not, or let's say you have one person who is unable to have children by virtue of their, a medical condition. We are still absolutely permitted to conduct a wedding between two such people, which, it argues against the case that that the purpose of marriage is having children. And certainly in Judaism, the purpose of marriage is far more than just having children. Okay, so it's almost 8 o'clock, but we are going to talk about next time. We're going to continue reading this article about whether you can be kicked out of being Jewish, which is sort of interesting. So Cheryl just posted, the mitzvah is only mandatory for men. For women, it is a mitzvah, but one that is not obligatory. So, and that's from Chabad. Yeah.
From Chabad.
Yeah. So I'm always nitpicky about the word mitzvah. Mitzvah is commandment. So I think Chabad is using it more in the Yiddish sense, where it's a good thing rather than a commandment. This is derived from various verses. When a woman has a child, she is considered to be sharing her husband's mitzvah equally with him, because he was only able to fulfill the mitzvah because of her partnership. So that's from Chabad.org. Yeah, that's interesting. And so one of the things, this is sort of a teaser for Wednesday, but because actually most of the people that attend on Monday also attend on Wednesday, is the issue of, in Reform Judaism, recognizing as Jewish the child of a Jewish man and a non-Jewish woman, is, I would say, one of the most disruptive things Reform Judaism has done, in my opinion. And it's actually not just, it actually has a very interesting legal basis, which we will discuss next time as well. So I wish you all a meaningful conclusion to your Memorial Day, and look forward to seeing you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.
And I will
Thank
I will
you.
mention it in the note that I sent out. Sonia and I are traveling next week, so we do not have classes either Monday or Wednesday of next week.
And isn't it your birthday coming up?
Yeah, it is. It's coming up tomorrow.
Oh, happy birthday.
Oh, happy birthday.
Thanks, Cheryl. Thanks,
Thank you.
Cheryl.
Thank you.
You're
Bye.
welcome.
Bye.
Welcome,
Thank you.
Alan.
Take
Good
care.
night.
Stay well.
Bye.